This rich man beats his 4-year-old daughter every day, but the horse saw everything and did something. Comment what you think will happen. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. Your help is very important. The biting cold of the June dawn seeped through the cracks of the old wooden house, bringing with it the heavy silence that precedes sunrise in rural upstate New York. Lily woke with a start, her small 4-year-old body trembling under the thin, tattered blanket that barely protected her from the chill. The purple bruises on her arms told the cruel story of the previous night when Frank Carter had once again vented his fury on the defenseless girl. The child remained motionless for long minutes, her dark eyes fixed on the damp-stained ceiling, trying to discern if the heavy footsteps echoing through the house belonged to the man who terrorized her. Frank, at 52, had built his reputation as a cattle trader through hard bargains and a temper that brooked no opposition. To him, Lily represented only a nuisance left behind by the housekeeper who had worked on his property until the previous year. Outside, through the frost-covered window, a pair of eyes watched the scene with peculiar attention. The white horse, with a coat as immaculate as the snow that rarely fell in that region, had stayed close to the house since the first hours of dawn. At 7 years old, the animal demonstrated an intelligence that surprised even the oldest neighbors on the farm. Outside of Albany, Frank appeared in the doorway of the room, his burly figure filling the frame as he regarded the girl with poorly disguised contempt. His small, hard eyes reflected the same coldness with which he conducted his business, treating people like commodities that could be discarded when they lost their usefulness. "Get up, girl," he growled, his rough voice cutting through the morning silence. "Got work to do." Lily rose slowly, her careful movements revealing the pain she felt in her fragile body. Even at her tender age, the girl had developed an impressive resilience, an inner strength that shone through her large, expressive eyes. She had learned to read Frank's moods, to anticipate his outbursts of anger, and to become almost invisible when necessary. As the child dressed in worn and undersized clothes, the horse outside emitted a low, drawn-out whinny. The sound seemed to touch something deep in Lily's heart, who approached the window and slightly parted the faded curtain. The animal watched her with an intensity that made her feel understood in a way she had never experienced with human beings. His eyes conveyed a gentleness that contrasted dramatically with the harshness of her environment. For a fleeting moment, girl and horse maintained eye contact, creating a silent connection that neither of them fully understood, but that both felt deep in their souls. "What are you standing there for?" Frank's voice exploded behind her, making her jump. "Get away from that window and go to the kitchen and make my coffee." Lily obeyed immediately, her bare feet touching the cold floor as she headed to the kitchen. Frank followed her, grumbling about the costs of keeping her and how she was nothing but a dead weight on his property. To the neighbors and acquaintances of the area, he maintained the story that the girl had been taken away by distant relatives after the loss of her mother, a lie that he repeated with conviction whenever someone asked about the child's whereabouts. In the dark and poorly ventilated kitchen, Lily climbed onto a chair to reach the necessary utensils. Her small hands trembled, not only from the cold, but from the constant fear that accompanied her from the moment she woke up until bedtime. Frank sat down at the rough wooden table, leafing through newspapers and making mental calculations about his next deals, treating the girl's presence as if she were part of the furniture. The horse remained close to the kitchen window, watching every movement through the grimy glass. His constant presence began to bother Frank, who did not understand why the animal insisted on staying so close to the house when he had the whole pasture at his disposal. "That damn horse is irritating me," he muttered, raising his eyes from the newspaper. "Stands there like he's watching something." Lily felt her heart race when she heard the irritation in the man's voice. She knew that when Frank got upset, someone always paid the price, and that someone was invariably her. The girl finished preparing the coffee with trembling hands, serving it in the enameled mug that he preferred. When she placed the mug before him, Frank noticed how her small fingers left wet marks on the handle due to nervousness. His irritation grew, fueled by the frustration of having to deal with a child he considered a burden. Outside, the horse emitted another whinny, this time louder and more persistent. The sound echoed through the silent property, breaking the morning tranquility in a way that made Frank clench his fists on the table. The persistent whinny of the horse echoed again, through the frigid morning, this time with an urgency that made Frank rise abruptly from his chair. His eyes narrowed as he watched the animal through the fogged window, and a vein popped out on his forehead when he realized that the horse kept his gaze fixed in Lily's direction. "That critter is defying me," he growled, heading to the back door with heavy steps that made the floor creak under his weight. Lily remained motionless by the stove, her small fingers gripping the hem of her worn nightgown as she watched Frank leave the house. The morning cold penetrated through the cracks in the door, but she barely felt the icy air compared to the ice that formed in her stomach whenever she witnessed the man's growing irritation. Outside, Frank approached the horse with threatening gestures, expecting the animal to retreat as the other horses on the property did. However, the white horse remained firm in his position, his intelligent eyes studying every movement of the man without showing the slightest sign of fear or submission. "Get out of here, you mutt!" Frank shouted, waving his arms in the air. "Go back to the pasture where you belong." The horse tilted his head slightly, as if he were assessing the man's words, but did not move an inch. His hooves remained planted on the firm ground, and his breath formed small clouds of vapor in the cold morning air. The majestic presence of the animal contrasted dramatically with Frank's growing agitation. Through the kitchen window, Lily watched the scene with a racing heart. Something in the horse's posture made her feel protected, as if the animal were there specifically for her. It was a strange and comforting feeling that she had never experienced before, a warmth that started in her chest and spread throughout her fragile body. Frank picked up a piece of wood that was lying on the ground and raised it threateningly towards the horse. "Last chance, you stubborn thing. Get out of here or you'll regret it." The horse remained impassive, but his eyes turned briefly to the window where Lily was watching. For a moment that seemed to last an eternity, girl and animal maintained eye contact through the dirty glass. It was as if the horse was sending a silent message, a promise that she was not alone in that cruel world. Frank's fury reached its limit when he noticed this exchange of glances. He threw the piece of wood at the horse, who dodged it agilely without losing his composure. The object hit the ground with a dry noise that made Lily recoil instinctively from the window. "That darn girl is driving this critter crazy," Frank muttered to himself, a dark suspicion beginning to form in his mind. "She's doing something to attract him here." When he returned to the kitchen, Frank found Lily exactly where he had left her, but something in her posture irritated him even more. The girl seemed less scared than usual, as if the horse's presence gave her a courage she did not possess before. "You," he said, pointing a thick finger in her direction. "What are you doing to call that horse here?" Lily shook her head timidly, her words coming out in an almost inaudible whisper. "Nothing, sir. I didn't do anything." "Liar!" Frank exploded, his voice echoing through the peeling walls of the kitchen. "Since you got here, that horse hasn't stopped causing trouble. Before he was obedient, now he's wandering around the house like a madman." The accusation was unfair, and they both knew it, but Frank needed someone to blame for his growing irritation. Lily represented the perfect target for his frustration, a defenseless child who could not defend herself or seek help. The days that followed brought a routine of increasing tension. The horse continued his silent vigil near the house, appearing whenever Lily was in the kitchen or near the windows. Frank tried to scare him away several times a day, but the animal invariably returned, as if fulfilling a mission that only he understood. During the second week of June, the cold intensified in an unusual way for the region. The mornings dawned with a dense fog that covered the pastures like a ghostly blanket, and the nights became even colder. Lily, who slept in a poorly heated room with only a thin blanket, began to feel the effects of the harsh cold on her already weakened body. It was on one of those especially cold nights that the first significant twist occurred. Lily, trembling uncontrollably under the inadequate blanket, heard heavy footsteps approaching her room. Frank had drunk more than usual during dinner, and his irritation with the stubborn horse had fermented throughout the day until it turned into a dangerous fury. "This situation is going to end today," he muttered as he opened the door to the girls' room. "You're going to tell me what you're doing to call that damn horse, or you're going to regret it." Lily cowered in the corner of the bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin as she watched Frank's menacing silhouette in the doorway. The dim light from the hallway created sinister shadows on his face, accentuating the angry expression that distorted his features. Outside, as if sensing the approaching danger, the horse began to emit low, restless whinnies. The sound penetrated the thin walls of the house, creating a disturbing soundtrack for the scene unfolding in the child's room. Frank approached the bed with slow, deliberate steps, his fists clenched at his sides. Lily could smell the alcohol on his breath and knew that this night would be different from the others. There was something in his posture that terrified her more than ever. It was at this moment of absolute terror that the horse outside began to strike the ground with his front hooves, creating an insistent rhythm that echoed through the silent property. The sound was loud enough to wake anyone within 100 yards, but it also carried an urgency that made Frank hesitate for an instant. The rhythmic sound of the horse's hooves against the ground echoed through the night like a war drum, breaking the silence that Frank so cherished on his isolated property. The hesitation that took hold of him lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough time for his attention to turn from the terrified girl to the persistent animal outside. "Damn him!" he growled, heading to the window with furious steps. "That horse is driving me crazy." Lily took advantage of the momentary distraction to huddle even further in the corner of the bed, pulling the blanket over her head in a desperate attempt to become invisible. Her heart was beating so fast that she feared Frank could hear it over the noise the horse was making outside. When Frank approached the window and pulled back the curtain, his eyes met those of the white horse through the glass. The animal had positioned himself strategically so that he could see both the window of Lily's room and the window of the living room, as if he were guarding the entire house. "You're defying me, aren't you?" Frank muttered, his voice filled with a rage that went far beyond mere irritation. "You think you can come here and boss around on my property?" The horse maintained eye contact with an intensity that made Frank recoil instinctively. There was something in the animal's eyes that disturbed him deeply, an intelligence that seemed to understand much more than any horse should be able to understand. Frustrated by the animal's audacity, Frank temporarily abandoned his plans with Lily and left the house with heavy steps. The night cold hit him like a slap in the face, but his fury kept him warm as he headed to the stable in search of a rope or whip that he could use to control the rebellious horse. Lily heard the front door slam shut and dared to peek out from under the blanket. The room was empty, but she could hear Frank grumbling outside as he rummaged through the stable. It was then that something extraordinary happened. The horse moved even closer to the bedroom window and began to emit low, comforting sounds, completely different from the loud whinnies he had used to get Frank's attention. It was almost as if he were whispering to her, trying to convey some kind of message through the glass that separated them. Lily got out of bed slowly, her bare feet touching the cold floor as she approached the window with cautious steps. When she got close enough, she placed the palm of her small hand against the cold glass, and the horse, as if understanding the gesture, pressed his muzzle on the other side, creating a moment of connection that transcended any physical barrier. "You're trying to help me," she whispered, her voice so low that she could barely hear herself. "You know I'm scared." The horse remained motionless for long minutes, as if confirming the girl's words. His eyes conveyed a compassion that Lily had never found in any human being, a deep understanding that made her feel less alone in the cruel world in which she lived. The magical moment was abruptly interrupted when Frank returned from the stable, carrying a long, flexible rod. Lily scrambled away from the window and hurried back to bed, pretending to be asleep when he entered the room again. "Where were you?" he asked suspiciously, noticing that the blanket was arranged differently. "Did you get out of bed?" "No, sir," Lily lied, her voice muffled by the blanket. "I was sleeping." Frank watched her for a few seconds before deciding that he had more urgent matters to resolve. The horse was still outside, and he was determined to put an end to that situation once and for all. When he left the house for the second time that night, Frank found the horse exactly where he had left him. The animal showed no sign of fear at the sight of the rod in his hands, standing firm in his position like a soldier at his post. "Last. A chance!" Frank threatened, raising the rod in the air. "Get out of here now, or you'll feel this rod on your back." The horse tilted his head slightly, studying the man with a calmness that was almost insulting. Then he did something completely unexpected. He took a few steps back, but not towards the pasture as Frank expected. Instead, he positioned himself so that he could see both the window of Lily's room and the place where Frank was standing. The message was clear. The animal had no intention of abandoning his vigil, regardless of the threats he received. Frank realized that he was being challenged by an opponent that he did not understand, but who clearly would not be intimidated by conventional methods. The second twist of the night occurred when Frank, in his growing frustration, decided to try a different approach. Instead of continuing to threaten the horse, he went to the barn and brought out fresh oats, placing them on the ground a considerable distance from the house. "Come and get it," he said, his voice forcedly calm. "I know you're hungry." The horse watched the offering for long minutes, but did not move towards the food. It was as if he understood that accepting the offer would mean abandoning his protective position, something he was clearly unwilling to do. Frank waited almost an hour, in the cold, growing increasingly irritated with the animal's stubbornness. When he finally gave up and collected the oats, the horse emitted a low whinny that sounded almost like a sigh of relief. Back in the room, Lily had managed to fall asleep despite the cold and fear that consumed her. Her dreams were populated by visions of the white horse running free through the fields, carrying her away from all the suffering she knew. When dawn broke, the third twist in the sequence of events revealed itself. The horse had remained on vigil all night, creating small circular footprints in the dirt around the house as he patrolled silently. The marks on the ground told the story of a dedication that went far beyond the normal behavior of an animal. Frank discovered the footprints when he went out to check if the horse had finally given up and returned to the pasture. The sight of the organized marks on the ground filled him with an unease that he could not explain. It was as if the animal was marking territory, establishing a claim on something that Frank considered exclusively his. During breakfast, he watched Lily with renewed suspicion. The girl seemed less dejected than in previous days, as if something had changed during the night. There was a different gleam in her eyes, a spark of hope that Frank had not seen for months. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Yes, sir," Lily replied, avoiding his gaze. But Frank noticed how she glanced discreetly towards the window, as if she were looking for something or someone outside. The suspicion that there was some kind of communication between the girl and the horse grew in his mind, planting seeds of a paranoia that would soon turn into something much more dangerous. The following weeks brought a subtle but perceptible change in the dynamics of the property. Frank began to watch Lily's every move with obsessive attention, looking for evidence of the connection that he suspected existed between her and the horse. His small, calculating eyes followed her around the house like a predator studying his prey. The girl, in turn, developed a heightened sensitivity to perceive Frank's moods. She learned to recognize the signs that preceded his outbursts of anger. The grinding of his teeth, the clenching of his fists, the way his breathing became heavier. This survival skill kept her constantly alert, but it also exhausted her emotionally. During the end of June, an unusual cold wave hit the Albany region. Temperatures plummeted during the nights, creating a thin layer of ice over the puddles that formed in the yard. Lily, with her inadequate clothes and insufficient food, began to feel the effects of the harsh climate more intensely. It was on one of those especially cold mornings that the fourth twist in the story unfolded. Lily woke up with a dry cough that left her breathless, and her forehead burned with the onset of a fever. When she tried to get out of bed to prepare Frank's coffee, her legs failed her and she fell to the floor with a dull thud. The horse, who maintained his morning vigil near the window, immediately realized that something was wrong. His whinnies became more urgent and frequent, carrying a note of alarm that cut through the cold morning air like a siren. Frank found Lily lying on the floor of the room, trembling violently with chills that shook her entire fragile body. For a moment, a spark of genuine concern passed through his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by the familiar irritation. "Get up from there," he ordered, his rough voice echoing through the small room. "I don't have time for pretending." But when Lily tried to obey, and again collapsed on the floor, Frank realized that the situation was more serious than he had imagined. The girl's skin was pale as paper, with red spots on her cheeks that indicated a high fever. Outside, the horse intensified his calls, walking in tight circles near the house. His behavior was so unusual that even Frank, in his growing concern for Lily's condition, noticed the animal's agitation. "That damn horse senses she's sick," he muttered to himself, a dark suspicion taking shape in his mind. How is it possible for an animal to know these things? During the next 3 days, while Lily struggled against the fever that kept her delirious in bed, the horse flatly refused to eat. He remained close to the house, completely ignoring the fresh oats that Frank placed in the pasture, as if he were holding a vigil of mourning. The fifth twist manifested itself when Mrs. Gable, the 60-year-old neighbor who lived on the adjacent property, began to notice the horse's strange behavior. She was hanging clothes on the clothesline when she heard the persistent and melancholic whinnies coming from the direction of Frank's house. Mrs. Gable had lost her 4-year-old granddaughter a few years earlier, a victim of pneumonia that developed rapidly during a harsh winter. The painful memory of this loss made her especially sensitive to signs of suffering, even when they came from an animal. "That horse is suffering from something," she commented to her husband, Mr. Gable, a 65-year-old retiree who had worked his whole life as a mechanic in the city. "I've never seen an animal act like this." Mr. Gable, a practical and observant man, had also noticed the changes in the horse's behavior. "Maybe we should take a look," he suggested, his genuine concern showing in his voice. "Frank sometimes forgets to take proper care of the animals when he's focused on business." Meanwhile, in the silent house, Lily raved with fever, whispering incomprehensible words that made Frank feel increasingly uneasy. In her moments of lucidity, she called for the horse, reaching her small hand towards the window as if she could touch him through the glass. "White horse," she murmured, her voice as faint as a whisper. Don't go away. Don't go away. Frank watched these scenes with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. The connection between the girl and the animal was undeniable, but he could not understand its nature. It was as if there was a secret language between them, a form of communication that escaped his understanding. On the third day of Lily's fever, the sixth twist brought an unexpected complication. Mrs. Gable, driven by her growing concern about the sounds of lament coming from the neighboring property, decided to pay a social visit to Frank under the pretense of delivering some fruit from her garden. When she arrived at the front door, she was greeted by Frank himself, who seemed more tense and irritated than usual. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, and there was an unease in his gestures that did not go unnoticed by the experienced woman. "Good morning, Frank," she greeted him with a forced smile. "I brought some fresh oranges from my tree. I thought you might like them." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," he replied, taking the bag of fruit without inviting her inside. "That was very kind of you." But Mrs. Gable was not easily discouraged. Her experienced eyes scanned what she could see of the interior of the house, noting the unusual mess and the smell of medicines that lingered in the air. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. "I've been hearing your horse making a lot of noise lately. He seems to be suffering." The mention of the horse made Frank's eyes narrow. "The horse is fine," he replied curtly. "He's just a little agitated because of the cold." "And that little girl I sometimes saw playing in the yard," Mrs. Gable continued, watching his reaction closely. "I haven't seen her around here in a while." The question hit Frank like a punch in the stomach. He had tried so hard to keep Lily hidden from the community that he had almost forgotten that some neighbors had occasionally seen her in the first months after her arrival. "Oh, she went to live with an aunt in Syracuse," he lied, trying to keep his voice steady. "The family thought it was best for her to have more opportunities in the big city." Mrs. Gable nodded slowly, but her eyes continued to study Frank's face. There was something in his expression that did not match the casual explanation he had given. It was as if he were hiding something important. "That's good that she's well taken care of," she said finally. "Children need a lot of love and attention, especially after losing their mother." Frank said goodbye quickly and closed the door, but the damage had already been done. Mrs. Gable's questions had planted a seed of suspicion that he knew could grow if it was not carefully controlled. Back in the room, Lily was beginning to show signs of improvement. Her fever had dropped slightly, and she managed to take a few sips of water without vomiting immediately. When Frank approached her bed, she watched him with eyes that seemed larger and more penetrating than before. "Is the horse still out there?" she whispered, her voice hoarse but clear. The question confirmed Frank's worst fears about the connection between them. "Why do you want to know about the horse?" he asked, his voice filled with suspicion. Frank's question hung in the air like a threat, but Lily was too weak to invent a convincing lie. Her eyes filled with tears as she tried to find words that would not put her in more danger. "He makes me feel less alone," she whispered finally, her childlike honesty breaking down any defense she might have built. The answer hit Frank unexpectedly. For a fleeting moment, he saw not the child he considered a burden, but a 4-year-old girl who had lost everything and clung to the only comfort she could find. However, this glimmer of compassion was quickly stifled by the paranoia that grew in his mind. "You can't be talking to animals," he said, his voice rough but without the usual fury. "People will think you're weird." During the following days, as Lily slowly recovered, Frank implemented measures to break the connection between her and the horse. He started by keeping the curtains closed during the day, preventing her from seeing the animal through the windows. He also changed her routine, making her stay in rooms of the house that did not have a view of the place where the horse used to stay. The horse, realizing the change, intensified his efforts to maintain visual contact with the house. He began to circle the property, trying to find different angles from where he could spot the windows. His whinnies became more melancholic, carrying a sadness that even Frank could feel. The seventh twist arrived when Mrs. Gable returned. This time accompanied by Mr. Gable. They brought as an excuse a pot of homemade soup, claiming that they had made more than they could consume. "I thought you might enjoy it," Mrs. Gable said, her shrewd eyes again observing the interior of the house when Frank opened the door. "With this cold, a warm soup works wonders." Frank accepted the offering reluctantly, but he could not prevent Mrs. Gable from noticing the sound of coughing that came from somewhere inside the house. It was a delicate cough, clearly of a child, which completely contradicted the story he had told about Lily having gone to live with relatives. "Sounds like you have a cold," she commented, feigning concern. "That cough doesn't sound good at all." It's just a cold," Frank stammered, realizing that he had been caught in his lie. "Nothing much." Mr. Gable, who had remained silent until then, pointed to the horse who was watching the scene from a distance. "That horse of yours is very thin," he commented with the objectivity of someone who knew animals. "When was the last time he ate properly?" The observation was accurate. The horse had lost considerable weight during the days in which he had refused to eat, worried about Lily's condition. His ribs were beginning to become visible under the white coat, and his eyes showed a deep sadness that was painful to watch. "He's being stubborn with his food," Frank admitted, annoyed at having to explain the animal's behavior. "Sometimes horses get like that when the weather changes." Mrs. Gable and Mr. Gable exchanged meaningful glances. Both had raised animals all their lives and knew that a horse doesn't refuse to eat because of changes in the weather. There was something deeper happening here, something that Frank clearly didn't want to discuss. After the neighbors left, Frank made a drastic decision that constituted the eighth twist in the story. He locked Lily in a room at the back of the house, a small, windowless space that had served as a pantry before he decided to use it to completely isolate her from the outside world. "You're going to stay here until you learn how to behave," he said, pushing her into the cramped space. "No windows, no chit-chat with horses, no nothing." The room was cold and damp, with only a small crack under the door that allowed a sliver of light to enter. Lily huddled in the corner, hugging her knees against her chest as she tried to process this new reality of complete isolation. Outside, the horse immediately realized that something had changed. He circled the house several times, looking for any sign of Lily, but could not locate her. His whinnies became more desperate, echoing through the property with an urgency that made even the birds fall silent. During the night, the horse did something he had never done before. He approached the front door of the house and began to strike the wood with his muzzle, creating a rhythmic sound that echoed through the interior of the building. It was as if he were knocking on the door, asking to come in and find Lily. Frank, awakened by the insistent noise, left the house wielding a rod, determined to put an end to that situation once and for all. "Now you've crossed the line," he shouted, advancing towards the animal. But the horse did not back down. Instead, he positioned himself between Frank and the door of the house, as if he were protecting something or someone inside. His eyes gleamed with a determination that made Frank hesitate. "Get out of the way," he ordered, raising the rod threateningly. The horse remained motionless, breathing heavily in the cold night air. It was as if he were willing to face any consequence to protect Lily, even not knowing exactly where she was. The ninth twist brought a dangerous escalation in the confrontation. Frank, losing his patience completely, struck a blow with the rod that hit the horse's flank. The animal emitted a whinny of pain that echoed through the night, but still did not leave his protective position. The sound of the horse's suffering reached the room where Lily was trapped. She pressed her ear against the door, trying to understand what was happening outside. When she recognized the whinny of pain, her tears began to flow freely. "Don't hurt him," she whispered to the closed door, knowing that no one could hear her. Please, don't hurt my horse." Frank dealt a few more blows, each leaving red marks on the animal's white coat. But the horse endured the pain without moving, demonstrating a loyalty that went far beyond the instinct for survival. It was then that the 10th and final twist of this phase of the story was revealed. The sound of the blows and the whinnies of pain had awakened Mrs. Gable, who lived close enough to hear the commotion. She woke Mr. Gable, and together they went to the window to investigate the source of the noise. What they saw shocked them deeply. Frank beating a defenseless horse who refused to get out of the way of his own house. The scene was so cruel and senseless that Mrs. Gable could not contain a scream of horror. "Mr. Gable, let's do something," she exclaimed, already heading to the door. "This is pure cruelty." Mr. Gable followed her, carrying a lantern that illuminated the macabre scene when they arrived in Frank's yard. The horse was bleeding, but still maintained his protective position, as if guarding secrets worth protecting, even at the cost of his own life. "Frank, what are you doing?" Mrs. Gable shouted, her voice filled with indignation. "Why are you mistreating this animal?" Frank turned to the neighbors, the rod still raised in his hands, his eyes gleaming with a fury that revealed a dark side of his personality that few had witnessed before. "This horse is sick," he lied, trying to justify his actions. "He's acting strangely. He needed to be disciplined." But Mrs. Gable was not fooled. Her experienced eyes saw beyond the lie, recognizing the signs of a man who had lost control over his own cruelty. The light from Mr. Gable's lantern revealed not only the wounds on the horse, but also the bloodstains on the ground and the desperate expression on Frank's face. Mrs. Gable approached the injured animal slowly, extending her hand carefully to assess his injuries. "This horse isn't sick, Frank," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He's protecting something, or someone." The neighbor's words hit Frank like a lightning bolt. He realized that his story about Lily having gone away was collapsing rapidly, and panic began to set in his mind. His eyes moved nervously between the neighbors and the door of the house, calculating his options. "You don't know what you're talking about," he murmured, lowering the rod but keeping it firmly gripped. "You better go home and mind your own business." Mr. Gable, a man who had faced difficult situations during his years as a mechanic in the city, was not intimidated by the veiled threat. "Frank, this horse is bleeding and refuses to get out of the way of your house. This isn't normal behavior. What are you hiding in there?" It was at this tense moment that a weak but unmistakable sound reached them through the closed door of the house. It was a child's voice, crying and calling for the horse. The sound was muffled, as if it came from far away or from a closed place, but it was clearly of a child in distress. "White horse," Lily's voice reached them like a ghostly echo. "Are you hurt? I feel like you're hurt." Mrs. Gable felt her heart stop for a moment. Her eyes widened as she processed what she had just heard. "Frank," she said, her voice sharp as a blade. "What child is that in there?" Frank's mask finally fell. He looked at the neighbors like a cornered animal, realizing that all his lies had been exposed. His hands trembled as he tried to formulate an explanation that could save him from the situation. She came back from her aunt's house," he stammered. "Arrived today. Her aunt couldn't take care of her." But no one believed his words. The sound of crying that came from inside the house told a very different story, a story of prolonged suffering and cruel isolation. Mr. Gable took a step towards the door of the house. "Let's see this child," he said, his voice filled with authority. "If she just arrived, why is she crying like that?" Frank blocked the way, wielding the rod. "Again? No one enters my house without my permission," he growled. "You have no right to come here and question me." The horse, who had patiently endured the pain of his injuries, chose this moment to act. With a surprising movement, he reared up on his hind legs and slammed his front hooves against the door of the house, creating a crash that echoed through the night. The noise was followed by a scream of terror from Lily, who recognized the sound as being from her protector. "Don't hurt him any more," she cried, her voice now clearly audible. "Please, he's just trying to help me." The girl's words revealed all the truth that Frank had tried to hide. Mrs. Gable turned to him with an expression of horror and indignation that made the man recoil instinctively. "You kept that child locked up," she accused, her voice trembling with rage. "That's why the horse doesn't eat. That's why he watches the house. He knows she's suffering in there." The communion between the animal and the child became evident to all those present. The horse was not only protecting Lily, he was communicating her suffering to the outside world, serving as a bridge between the isolated girl and the people who could help her. Mr. Gable did not wait for further explanations. He advanced towards the door, determined to check on the child's condition. Frank tried to stop him, but the horse positioned himself between them, blocking the cattle trader's access to the neighbors. "Get out of the way, you mutt!" Frank shouted, raising the rod again. But this time Mrs. Gable interfered. She grabbed Frank's arm with a force surprising for a woman of her age. "Enough!" she shouted. "You've done enough harm for one night." The distraction was enough for Mr. Gable to reach the door and push it open forcefully. The old wood gave way easily, revealing the interior of the house in disarray. They followed, the sound of Lily's crying, until they found the room where she was locked. When Mr. Gable opened the pantry door, the sight that greeted him left him speechless. Lily was curled up in the corner, her small body trembling with cold and fear. Her clothes were dirty and torn, and there were evident signs of abuse on her arms and legs. "My God," Mrs. Gable whispered, who had followed her husband. "How can someone do this to a child?" Lily raised her eyes to the strange but gentle faces that watched her. "Is the horse okay?" she asked, her first concern being for the animal that had tried to protect her. "I heard him crying." The question broke Mrs. Gable's heart. Even in her desperate situation, the girl was more concerned about the horse than about herself. It was a demonstration of purity and compassion that contrasted brutally with the cruelty she had suffered. "He's going to be all right, honey," Mrs. Gable said, extending her arms to Lily. "And you're going to be all right, too. No one will hurt you anymore." As Lily left the room supported in Mrs. Gable's arms, the horse saw her through the open door and emitted a soft whinny, almost like a sigh of relief. The girl extended her small hand towards the animal, and he approached carefully, touching her fingers with his bloodied muzzle. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she whispered to the horse, her tears mixing with the blood on the animal's wounds. Frank, realizing that his situation was irreversibly lost, tried one last desperate move. "She's my responsibility," he said, his voice sounding weak and unconvincing. "Her mother worked for me. I have the right to take care of her." "Take care?" Mrs. Gable exploded. "You call this taking care? That child is malnourished, hurt, and terrified. This isn't care, it's torture." In the days that followed, the story of Lily and the horse spread through the Albany community like wildfire. Pastor Johnson, a 70-year-old man known for his dedication to social causes, organized a community mobilization to ensure that the girl received adequate care. Mrs. Gable, moved by the painful memory of her lost granddaughter and by the maternal instinct that had never been completely satisfied, offered to adopt Lily officially. The process was accelerated by the evident neglect and cruelty that the girl had suffered. The horse, treated by a veterinarian from the city, fully recovered from his physical injuries. He was included in the adoption, officially recognizing the special bond that existed between him and Lily. Frank, in turn, found himself completely isolated by the community. His businesses began to fail when business partners refused to work. With someone capable of such cruelty, loneliness and social ostracism became his daily punishment, a constant. reminder of the consequences of his actions. A year later, on a sunny June morning, Lily was playing in the yard of Mrs. Gable's house, riding the white horse that had saved her life. Her laughter echoed through the property, a sound that had become music to the ears of her new family. The horse, now well-fed and cared for, carried the girl with the delicacy of someone transporting the greatest treasure in the world. Frank, watching the scene from a distance from his abandoned property, finally understood what he had lost. Not only the opportunity to be a positive influence in the life of a child, but also the chance to experience redemption through love and compassion. His greed and cruelty had cost him everything that really mattered, leaving him with nothing but regret and loneliness for the rest of his days.